Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to continue our chapter about the inflation, the causes and the effects, and the social costs of inflation. We talk about the definition and the money supply and the relation between the increasing of the money supply growth and the inflation rate. And also the relationship between the inflation rate and the interest rate and the Fisher effect. Now we are going to continue and finalize our chapter by two main topics about the social costs of inflation and the hyperinflation. First, the social costs of inflation. What do you think about the costs of inflation, or why we have the perception of this? The inflation is bad. What is the costs that the inflation impose on society? You can think about some costs before proceeding in the next slides. Um, Before talking in details about the costs of inflation in the society, there is a common misperception. Perception is like the image that you take about something or impression and so on. So there is maybe this perception is not right. So there is a common misperception between people that inflation reduces the real wages. The real wages. Why this is a misperception? If you think about it, now we say, مثلا, for example, that inflation, the prices increases. If you think about 5 years ago, the price of any product is now doubled or increased from nowadays. But if you think also on the other side, the real wages of the workers, employees, and so on are also increased during these years. It's not the same. So this is the misperception. This is true only in the short run, when the nominal wages are fixed by contracts. The inflation reduces the real wages only on the short run. For example, if you an employee have a contract, for example, for 5 years in the future, and the salary is determined on a specific amount of money, and plus 10% increase each year according to the expected inflation rate. So we talk in the long run in the chapter 3. The real wage is determined by the labor supply and the marginal product of labor. That's what determines the real wage. So it's not the price level or the inflation rate who determines the real wages. So considering this data, we can see the average hourly earnings and the CPI, as a CPI with this red scale right line, and the wage in current dollars in the blue line, and we can see the wage in the real wage in with $2006, as we can see from this chart, that first the CPI has risen tremendously over the past 40 years. However, the nominal wages, which is in the blue line, rising by a roughly similar magnitude. So the nominal wage rises as the CPI, or the consumer price index, rises, as we said. So if the common misperception were true, then the real wage should show exactly the opposite behavior as the CPI. But it doesn't, as the real wage is not constant. It varies within the range of 15 and 19, if you can see in the left side in the vertical axis, the hourly wage. The real wage is ranging between $15 and $19 per hour, but there is no downward trend in the real wage over the long term. Okay, but we have to note that we wouldn't expect the real wage to be constant over the long run. We would expect it to change in response to shifts in the labor supply and the marginal product labor curves. Okay, so the classical view of inflation, which assumes that a change in the price level is merely a change in the units of measurement. This classic view for inflation, according to what we explained now, that while the prices rises during several years, also the real wages rises during these years. So change in the price level is not real, it's merely a change in the units of measurements. For example, yeah, the unit of measurement, like if you measure a distance by meters, it's the same if you measure the same distance with yards. It's a different unit of measurement, meters and yards, but the distance is still the same. So why then the inflation is a social problem? Now we are going to talk about the costs of the inflation. We have two categories. The costs with inflation is expected, and the costs when it is inflation is different than people had expected. So first, the costs of the expected inflation. The first cost is called the shoe leather cost. Shoe leather cost, it comes from the shoes that we wear in foot and so on. It's called shoe leather cost. Why it's called like this? The costs and inconveniences of reducing money balances to avoid the inflation cost tax. So this is the shoe leather cost, the cost and inconveniences of reducing money balances to avoid the inflation tax. How? As we know, when the actual inflation rate rises, so the nominal rate will rise, and the real money balances will reduce. So in the long run, the inflation doesn't affect the real income or the real spending. So same monthly spending, you have the same money spending, but lower average money holdings means more frequent trips to the bank to withdraw smaller amounts of cash. So you have the same amount of money, but the same monthly spending are the same, but lower average money you hold. So you have to go to the bank many times instead of you go each week, one time per week to withdraw money from the bank to spend for your weekly expenses. So now you have to go two times or three times to withdraw smaller amounts of cash. That's frequent trips to the bank. That's why it's called shoe leather cost. Second cost is the menu cost. Menu cost, the costs of changing prices. For example, the cost of printing new menus for the restaurants or any other shops and so on, the cost of printing and mailing new catalogs for clothes or furniture or so on. So the cost of when the price is changed, you have to print the menu again, to have to print the catalogs again. So the higher the inflation, the higher the prices changed, the more frequently firms must change their prices and incur these costs. Third, the relative price distortions. Third cost. As firms facing menu costs change prices infrequently. So, for example, a firm issues new catalog each year, each January. As the general price level rises throughout the year, the firm's relative price will fall. So different firms change their prices at different times, leading to relative price distortions, causing microeconomic inefficiencies in the allocation of resources. The fourth cost is the unfair tax treatment, which is very important. The unfair tax treatment. How some taxes are not adjusted to account for inflation, such as the capital gains tax. For example, at the beginning of the year, you buy stocks from the IBM corporation, with the amount of $10,000. And at the end of the year, you will sell these stocks for $10,000. So your nominal capital gain, we say here nominal, not real, your nominal capital gain is 10%, which means $1,000. But if we suppose that the inflation rate is 10% during this year, so your real capital gain will be $0. But plus the government also requires you pay taxes on this $1,000 nominal gain. So this is why what's the cost of the unfair tax treatment. The fifth cost is the general inconvenience, which means that the inflation makes it harder to compare nominal values from different time periods. This complicates the long-range financial planning. You cannot plan for the future. For example, parents trying to decide how much to save for the future college expenses of their young child, and also persons trying to decide how much to save for retirement, or the CEO of a big corporation trying to decide whether to build a new factory which will yield a revenue stream for the 20 years or more. All these fluctuations in the inflation rate make it hard to make future financial plans. So this was the expected inflation costs. What about the unexpected inflation costs? We have the arbitrary redistribution of the purchasing power, which means the many long-term contracts not indexed but based on the expected inflation. Many long-term contracts not indexed but based on the expected inflation. As we said, you have a contract for employee, or experts have a contract for or maybe a construction company have a contract for building for 5 years, and they bought the compensation according to a 10% inflation expected inflation rate. But if the actual inflation rate will end up with different from the expected inflation rate at the beginning, then there is some gain at other expense. For example, also the same thing with the borrowers and the lenders. If the actual inflation rate is larger than the expected inflation rate, then the nominal interest rate minus the actual interest rate will be lower than the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation rate, and the purchasing power is transferred from lenders to borrowers. The same thing or the opposite, when the actual inflation rate will be less than the expected inflation rate, then the purchasing power is transferred from the borrowers to the lenders. Also, the increased uncertainty. When inflation is high, it's more variable and more unpredictable. So the actual inflation rate turns out different than the expected inflation rate more often, and the differences tend to be larger, though not systematically positive or negative. So the arbitrary redistributions of wealth become more likely, and this creates higher uncertainty, making risk-averse people worse off. We have only one benefit of inflation. We will see this in details in chapter 6 about employment and so. But if we talk about the nominal wages, which are rarely reduced, as we said, usually the nominal wages are increasing over years, not reduced, even when the equilibrium real wage falls. So this hinders labor market clearing, as inflation allowed the real wages to reach the equilibrium levels without the nominal wage cuts. Therefore, moderate the inflation improves the functioning of the labor markets. Yani, let's imagine if the government مثلا instead of making a nominal wage cut, يعني a cut in the wages of the workers or employees according to money, we are talking about the nominal wage. So instead of making 2% cut, if the مثلا the inflation rate is 3%, and the government wants to make 2% cut for their employees. So instead of making this wage cut, which is not acceptable by the public, so it will may increase the inflation rate to 5% instead of 3%. So the difference or the change, which is the 2%, it is like the as it makes wage cuts by 2%. So this is the costs of the expected and unexpected inflation. Now we are going to talk about the hyperinflation. Hyperinflation may be the inflation rate that is larger than 50% per month. Well, most of the economists or textbooks don't prefer to put a specific number, especially if we مثلا consider that the inflation rate was more than 49%. Will it be hyperinflation or not? Sure, it will be excessive also. So يعني average we can say that inflation rate is larger than 50% per month. This is called hyperinflation. Or all the costs of moderate or normal inflation described above become huge under the hyperinflation. All the costs that we just talked about in the normal inflation become more and huge and more excessive under the hyperinflation. So money ceases to function as a store of value and may not serve its other functions like a unit of account or medium of exchange. And in the case of hyperinflation, so people may conduct transactions with barter or stable foreign currency instead. So what causes the hyperinflation? Hyperinflation usually caused by excessive money supply growth. When the money supply growth increased and be more excessive, not like the normal inflation, but more excessive. When the central bank prints money, the price level rises. But if it prints money more rapidly enough, the result is hyperinflation. And we can see here some examples for some countries in different periods of times for the percentage of money supply growth and the inflation rate. We can see they are very related in each country. When the money supply growth increased, the inflation rate also increased, as we can see. So why governments create hyperinflation? If we know that it's very bad, it's have many costs, and so why they do so? We know that the government revenues are basically from the taxes and from the selling bonds. So when the government cannot raise taxes anymore, or cannot, so if they raise taxes, they have a limit. They cannot raise taxes in unlimited basis or forever. Also, they cannot sell bonds because the public are not. There is no trust that the government can pay these interest rates and the principal of the bonds. So it must finance spending increases by printing money. The government have a lot of spendings. How can they finance these spendings? By increasing the printing of money. Theoretically, the solution for hyperinflation is simple, which is to stop printing money. But in the real world, this requires drastic and painful fiscal restraints. We used to say that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, but now we can see that there is more drastic and painful fiscal restraint have to be done by the government to stop the hyperinflation. Finally, we are going to talk about the classical dichotomy. Dichotomy means two branches or two ways, as we see the real variables and the nominal variables. The real variables which measured in the physical units and quantities and relative prices. For example, the quantity of output produced, quantity of the output produced, the real wage, for example, output earned per hour of work, the output earned per hour of work, not the money. The real interest rate also, the output earned in the future by lending 1 unit to output today. On the other hand, the nominal variables, which is measured in money units, so the real variables are measured by physical units and quantities and relative prices. Now the nominal variables are measured in money units, like the nominal wage is dollars per hour of work. Nominal interest rate is dollars earned in future by lending $1 today. Also the price level is the amount of dollars needed to buy a representative basket of goods. So the real variables were explained previously in chapter 3, and the nominal values or variables we discussed in chapter 4. So the classical dichotomy of this, that the theoretical separation of real and nominal variables in the classical model, which implies nominal variables don't affect the real variables. That's why we are talking about this, the theoretical separation of the real and the nominal variables in this classical model implies that the nominal variables don't affect the real variables. So that's why we say that the money is neutral, which means changes in the money supply don't affect the real variables. Changes in the money supply don't affect the real variables. In the real world, money is approximately neutral in the long run. So now we finished our chapter about the inflation and the causes, effects, and the costs of inflation, and also the hyperinflation. Thank you and see you next lesson, inshallah. Goodbye and good luck.